The Muskoka Lakes Association is proudly celebrating 125 years of working on behalf of fellow Muskokans. Whether the issue of the day is safe boating, political leadership, acid rain, water quality, or responsible development, the MLA is committed to advocating for its members. We would like to acknowledge and thank past and present board members for their many accomplishments and tireless efforts. Together, we can and will preserve Muskoka for future generations.
Welcome to the 125th anniversary of the Muskoka Lakes Association. My name is Joan Booth and I am the honorary president. I think it's relevant to go back in time to 1894 to see what was happening then in Muskoka. The cottagers came from Canada and the United States. The main method of transportation to the lakes was by train and then by steamboat. There were no telephones, so social events were announced by yoo-hooing from one island to the next, or boating or walking if you were on the mainland. The boats were canoes, rowboats, sailboats, and steamships. There were, at that time, many large and small hotels. The small ones were plentiful, as farming proved not to be lucrative. It was a young and developing Muskoka, becoming more populated and busy. It had its problems, though. So some concerned landowners decided it needed a watchdog to look after it, for the benefit of the water, the land, and its people. And so, on February the 19th, 1894, 22 men came together at the Toronto Athletic Club for the purpose of forming an association that would be the eyes, ears, and protector of Muskoka. The first mission statement was to unite together all those interested in the three lakes, Muskoka, Rosso, and Joseph, and their vicinities, for the purposes of protecting and promoting the interests of property owners, cottagers, and tourists, preserving the healthful sanitary condition and scenic beauty of the vicinity, and encouraging aquatic and other sports. This lasted for over 100 years. At the first meeting, the men formed a regatta committee and a general committee. The General Committee knew what they wanted to accomplish in the next year, as it seems that improved transportation facilities, improved waterways, and improvements with regard to baggage destined for the Lake District had been accomplished. By 1895, the association had 300 families as members. In the next year, assessments and taxation were in the forefront, as well as protection of property, and a very handsome yearbook was issued. By 1914, sewage problems created by the steamboats, resorts, and poor quality septic tanks was on the agenda, as well as proper lighting on boats and controls over speedboat mufflers. High water levels on the lakes was an issue a few years later. So it is interesting to note that many of the same problems that we are dealing with today were the very same ones that prompted those 22 men to come together and form the association. The MLA has been and still is a big influence in Muskoka, lobbying all levels of government for safety and environmental protection for 125 years. Winning some, losing some, but always putting the interests of Muskoka first. Its directors have been, and still are, dedicated to the preservation of a most beautiful area, one that has been touted as the most beautiful place in the world. The Muskoka Lakes Association has made a big difference, and this year we celebrate 125 years of achievements.
What else was happening in Muskoka in the late 19th century? At the time the Muskoka Lakes Association was established in 1894, Muskoka was already famous as a tourist destination in Canada and the United States. Dozens of hotels welcomed thousands of tourists each year, and hundreds of cottages dotted the shorelines of the lakes. But tourism and cottaging was not the only thing happening in Muskoka at the end of the 19th century. For hundreds of years prior to the arrival of Europeans, the Anishinaabe peoples of south-central Ontario spent part of every year in Muskoka, hunting and trapping. Muskoka's First Nations did not disappear with white resettlement. Most of Muskoka's First Nations had not been included in the 1850 Robinson-Huron Treaty. Not until the 1923 Williams Treaty were their rights to Muskoka acknowledged. During that time, Indigenous peoples continued to return to Muskoka to pursue opportunities presented by tourism. Women and their children sold crafts, while men worked as hunting and fishing guides. Many made a good living at this work. In 1889, for example, 5 years before the MLA was founded, an Indian agent for Rama reported that some guides earned as much as $60 per month. Further back from the lakes, tourists engaged in agriculture, logging, and tanning, activities which cottagers and tourists rarely witnessed. It might be hard to believe, but tourism emerged at almost the same time as agriculture and logging in Muskoka. Settlers who took up land unsuited to farming often abandoned their lots. Those who stayed experimented with different crops and discovered the best way to use their land. Living close to the lakes presented opportunities for farmers to produce fresh vegetables, eggs, dairy, and meat, which they sold to hotels and cottagers. Further inland, farmers grew oats, potatoes, and hay, and sold them to lumber camps. Those next to the shore built and repaired cottages, cut ice for ice houses, and chopped firewood. In the backwoods, many settlers sold their labor to logging camps. Most early MLA members never saw the work that loggers performed in Muskoka, yet tourists and cottagers occasionally confronted the consequences of logging operations. On occasion, MLA members encountered other signs of logging, such as steamboats towing enormous booms of logs. Just a few years before the MLA was founded in April 1889, residents of Bracebridge complained that logs obstructed navigation and mail delivery, and campers sometimes found it impossible to traverse the river and reported having to turn back. Those who made it to Bracebridge passed another important part of Muskoka's local economy: the twin tanneries of the Muskoka Leather Company and Shaw Castles and Company, later renamed the Anglo-Canadian Leather Company. These industries processed tens and later hundreds of thousands of hides per year. The tanneries operated in Muskoka because nature's generous supply of hemlock trees provided the bark used in tanning leather. Rarely, though, did tourists or cottagers witness the tanning process itself. But quite often, scows piled high with hemlock barks were visible around the lakes. Muskoka featured a variety of economic activities at the end of the 19th century. But by 1894, tourism and cottaging provided the logic for the creation of the Muskoka Lakes Association, which worked to protect Muskoka for future generations.
When the Muskoka Lakes Association was formed in 1894, the steamships had already been traveling the lakes for 28 years. Alexander Peter Coburn built his first ship, the Winona, in 1866. Coburn was an entrepreneur and realized the importance of water transportation for settlers, the logging and hotel industries, and for private cottages. He campaigned for construction of the locks in Port Carling and the cut between Lake Rosso and Lake Joseph at Port Sandfield. By 1871, his ships could navigate from Gravenhurst to all parts of the three lakes. By the 1890s, he had 5 ships in service, and the MLA were urging the use of holding tanks on those ships to avoid the waste going directly into the lake. During this period, skilled local boat builders began building rowboats and sailboats for cottagers and hotels. William Johnson of Port Carling and Henry Ditchburn of Rosso were preeminent, supplying boats for rent at Windermere House on Lake Rosso and Elgin House on Lake Joseph and many other places. In the early years of the MLA, growth in Muskoka was exponential. By 1900, Muskoka's permanent population had grown to over 10,000. Private cottages dotted the shorelines, and there were over 30 hotels on the lakes. And by 1914, the MLA was speaking out for better septic systems at the hotels. Around 1905, with the advent of gasoline engines, the local builders of rowboats and sailboats saw the potential to build motorboats for wealthy cottagers. They successfully built larger boats to the demanding specifications of North America's finest naval architects. The major boat builders were Johnson, Matheson, and Duke in Port Carling. Minette, Barnes, and Brown were in Bracebridge, and Grivet and Ditchburn in Gravenhurst. The first quarter of the 20th century were the golden years for steamboats, hotels, and boat builders in Muskoka. More than a dozen steamers served about 50 tourist establishments, including the grand hotels like the Royal Muskoka. In 1924, the MLA responded, installing navigational aids marking the shoals, and later advocated for speed limits in narrow channels. Even then, though, things were changing. First the trains, then the roads and the automobiles were eclipsing the steamers. Many hotels had burnt or were closing, and by the end of the 1960s, the remaining hotels were in decline. The steamers were retired in 1958, having lost their mail contracts. Locally built wooden boats gave way to popular fiberglass models manufactured outside of Muskoka. However, in the late 1970s, restoration began on the RMS Seguin, which is now the oldest operating ship in North America. She was returned to service in 1982. In 1976, the Muskoka Lakes Association initiated an antique boat show in Port Carling to celebrate the beauty and the heritage of boat building in Muskoka. These biannual shows have since grown into one of North America's top antique boat shows, a fitting tribute to Muskoka's incredible boat builders.
Acid rain was a destructive scourge to our rivers and lakes, our forests and fields. It was identified in the 70s, fought against in the 80s, and thankfully contained in the 90s with considerable help from the Muskoka Lakes Association. I am a past president of the Canadian Coalition on Acid Rain and a past Commodore of the Muskoka Lakes Association. The MLA was an original member of the coalition. Many of our directors and members contributed their time and considerable talents to reduce the fossil fuel emissions of sulfur and nitrogen particulates that floated into our atmosphere and returned to Earth as acid rain, destroying our water quality, our natural ecosystems, and our health. In the mid-80s, acid rain reached a pH of 4, which is the equivalent of vinegar. The runoff leached mercury, molybdenum, and other heavy metals from the earth that poisoned the rivers and lakes and killed the food chain from plankton on up. The source of acid rain in Muskoka and the distance that it traveled were mapped by releasing radioactive isotopes in the chimneys of suspected polluters in the Ohio Valley and tracking their emissions with the weather satellites. The effect of acid rain was first recognized in Canada in 1966 by University of Toronto ecologist Harold Harvey, and was brought to the attention of MLA by Doug Wilson. The problem peaked in the 80s when some 700,000 lakes in North America were at risk, 150,000 lakes were seriously damaged, and 15,000 lakes were deemed dead, with no plant life, no plankton, no fish, no insects, no fowl. At that time, 30 million tons of sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide were being emitted into the atmosphere in North America each year. The total economic consequences of acid rain in North America was estimated to be some $10 billion per year. The Conservative government of the day helped to establish the Canadian Coalition on Acid Rain. In 1981, a formal coalition was established with 12 members that grew to some 50 organizations representing 2 million Canadians. It became a very powerful political force and an important source of funding. A series of well-attended and well-publicized fundraising dinners were organized by the MLA leadership team with keynote speakers including our Canadian ambassador in Washington, Alan Gottlieb, writer Margaret Atwood, Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, and Minnesota Senator David Durenberger. The science, the education, the publicity, and the advocacy created the necessary political will for our Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and U.S. President Ronald Reagan to prioritize the reduction of acid emissions. On November 15, 1990, the Clean Air Act was revised and signed into law by President George H.W. Bush, who joined Prime Minister Mulroney on March 31, 1991, to sign the U.S.-Canada Air Quality Agreement. Muskoka Lakes Association is justifiably proud of the contribution it made to the fight against acid rain. We can and we do make a difference.
From the time people started coming to Muskoka to cottage, they've been changing the land use around them. From clearing building lots, taking down the trees, erecting boathouses and docks in the water, and changing the shoreline. At first there weren't that many cottages, under 400 in the early 1900s, growing exponentially to just over 8,000 in 1955 and 13,500 by 2012. The Muskoka Lakes Association has been there throughout this growth, looking after the interests of the shoreline residents. Cottage ownership increased in the post-war boom of the 50s and 60s, largely because of the increased personal mobility offered by car ownership and improved road access, so that the idea of owning a weekend refuge from the city was now within reach of the average family. And with that boom, the face of Muskoka began to change. Cottages began to flourish along the shoreline, along with the support services needed to support the seasonal population, and the resort industry would unfortunately experience a long and slow decline. Not surprisingly, resort properties were being sold to other interests and became a major source of conflict that the MLA has engaged in over the years. One of the first issues was at Roseneath in Milford Bay in the early 1980s, where a developer proposed 147 units for an expected population of 700 people, larger than Port Carling, and at densities comparable to urban centers. Sewage treatment alone would require a 50-acre tile bed. The MLA joined forces with others in challenging the township approval to the Ontario Municipal Board. And while the challenge was not successful, the MLA later opposed building permits and the developer eventually abandoned the project. Decades later, local residents purchased the land and converted it to a park. The MLA learned that vigilance about land use issues in Muskoka would be needed, not to help neighbors fight neighbors over differences of opinion, but to identify issues that have far-reaching ramifications for the environment of Muskoka, issues that set precedent such that it could happen again. One of these was Hannah's Landing, the former Glenwood Trailer Park in Port Carling. The owner proposed approximately 400 residential units outside the urban boundary of Port Carling and to change zoning from waterfront and rural to urban in an area of existing cottage development. Again, the development was the same size as the existing residential community in Port Carling. The MLA, along with others, objected to a boundary expansion, and while the Township of Muskoka Lakes eventually approved it, the size of the development was reduced, and protection for the shoreline and the abutting properties were included in the official plan amendment. To date, it has not been built, but the MLA continues to watch the file carefully. Everyone wants to come to Muskoka for a break from city life, to experience nature, breathe fresh air, swim, fish, see the stars, and hear the birds. The very reasons to come to Muskoka may be lost without someone like the MLA keeping watch and questioning what is in keeping with the intent and policies of the municipalities to protect the Muskoka environment. The Muskoka Lakes Association has not always been successful in our challenges of planning decisions, but we're certain that some bad developments were made better for engaging in the discussion.
What makes the Muskoka Lakes special are its pristine waters. People came here from as early as the 1960s to get away from the smog and the pollution in the cities and to enjoy the pristine, clean environment that was afforded by Muskoka. The Muskoka Lakes Association recognized this in its founding principles in 1894, and the one particularly having to do with environmental protection was the one that said they were going to preserve the healthful sanitation and scenic beauty of the Muskoka Lakes. The Environmental Protection Committee got busy immediately and recommended the use of septic tanks to its members and provided them a design in 1903. Following the lobbying of township government, a sanitary inspector became part of the township's permanent staff in 1906. By 1910, the MLA had targeted the steamship practice of flushing waste directly to the lakes, resulting in holding tanks being installed by the 5 largest ships. By 1914, the septic practices of resorts were questioned, and the MLA worked hard with the Ontario Department of Health in the examination of 56 resorts, and many upgrades to their septic systems followed this inspection. In the early 1960s, a new concern emerged as algae blooms started to occur throughout the lakes. The Ontario Water Resources Commission drew the MLA's attention to phosphorus contamination as a source, and the prime sources of this contamination were detergents and fertilizers. By 1970, the MLA had a water testing program in place, testing for water clarity and for bacteria and for algae. And to combat the algae problem, MLA launched a swap program in 1971. They sent people out around the lakes and collected the detergents and gave them ivory soap flakes in exchange. Amazingly, this had an immediate and measurable effect on the presence of algae in the lakes. The bacteria testing revealed a problem outside a major lodge in Lake Rosso in 1974. A closure of the facility followed while the corrective action was taken. Throughout this period, the MLA continued to educate its members about proper care of their septic systems in order to protect the lakes. Since 2001, over 100 dedicated volunteers enabled nearly 1,500 tests to be done annually across the lakes through the summer months. An annual report is produced and communicated to township inspectors and politicians. Hotspots continue to be identified and brought to the authorities for resolution. So the Muskoka Lakes Association will remain vigilant for water quality now and into the future to ensure that we continue to have fresh, clean, and enjoyable water for recreation and for our cottage pursuits.
The Muskoka Lakes Association is proudly celebrating 125 years of working on behalf of fellow Muskokans. Whether the issue of the day is safe boating, political leadership, acid rain, water quality, or responsible development, the MLA is committed to advocating for its members. We would like to acknowledge and thank past and present board members for their many accomplishments and tireless efforts. Together, we can and will preserve Muskoka for future generations.